Welcome everyone to another episode of the Far East Times. I'm your host Eli Ayoub, and I'm joined today with Molly Crabapple, who has a special relationship with this project in the sense that she illustrated the portraits that we use on From the Periphery. Molly was also on the Far East Times, I think it was 5 years ago, I think it was in the beginning of this podcast, to talk about the Bund, because since then you went and wrote an entire book. The topic of the Bund, and especially of the concept of Doikayt, of Hereness, all of this, we're going to explain this, so don't worry, listeners, if you don't know what that is, has become, I feel, and I have a feeling you would agree, even more relevant in recent years. And before I forget, which of course I did, so hi, this is Elia from the future trying to save my own ass. We will be talking about an essay by Naomi Klein and Astra Taylor called The Rise of End-Time Fascism. Naomi and Astra will be on the Friday Times soon, as well as with my co-host Daniel Kurd, to talk about the essay. To get early access to that episode, you can join us on patreon.com/fromtheperiphery. By doing so, you would be supporting the From the Periphery Media Collective, of which the Friday Times is a part, as well as getting exclusive content, an invitation to our monthly hangout, our ongoing movie club, as well as other perks. And hopefully you would also be part of a growing community, that I would hope you would also enjoy. Okay, and here is a smooth transition back into the present, which is technically the past when you're listening to this in the present, which is the future of when I'm recording this, but also the future of when this is so complicated. Here's the episode. Yeah, I guess a way to just start us is talk a bit about your journey to researching the Bund and this concept and how you came about to writing this book.
I'm so grateful to be back on the podcast again. And I feel like the conversations that we had at the start of my project on the Bund helped shape how I thought about things as I wrote this crazy 400-page book. How did I come to the Bund? Well, I came to it through my great-grandfather. My great-grandfather, Samuel Rothbard, was a post-impressionist painter who was from what's now Belarus and who taught my mother how to paint. And so in turn, through the generations, kind of taught me how to paint. And I grew up entirely surrounded by Sam's paintings, by sculptures, by his self-published writing, and especially by these watercolors that he called memory paintings that were 600 images of the murdered world of his shtetl childhood in Volkovisk. They showed every aspect of life in the small town he grew up in, from the most sacred to the most profane, from men reading the Torah to Jewish girls fucking their Russian boyfriends behind a fence while their dads looked for them. So everything. But there was one painting that I was always obsessed with. It showed a young woman who had her hair up in a Gibson girl hairdo and a little corseted waist. And she was standing on a dirt alleyway at twilight, throwing a rock through a window. And next to her was her boyfriend, who was holding more rocks, because a lady should not carry her own rocks on date night. And this painting was so different from everything that I thought about what a young Jewish woman would be in 1903 that I grew obsessed with it. And especially I grew obsessed with its title, which was Itke the Bundist. I remember turning those words over on my tongue. Itka, the old-fashioned name, and Bundist, what was that? It was this watercolor that led me to the story of the Jewish Labor Bund, which was a secular, socialist, anti-Zionist, and defiantly Jewish revolutionary party that my great-grandfather had belonged to back in his hometown. It was a party that educated shtetls, freed prisoners, fought religious fundamentalists, battled on the barricades against the goons of the Tsar, defended its people against pogroms. And most of all, it was a party that believed that Jews had the right to live in their Eastern European homes of the last 1,000 years. They believed that in spite of all of the racism of Eastern European society, in spite all of the state oppression and all of the freelance violence, that there where they lived was their country, and they decided to fight for that.
And the concept that kind of underpins a lot of that philosophy, Doikayt, which is translated as Hereness, as in here, and from the Yiddish. A bit of a backstory just on me. for those who don't know, I have mentioned this before, but 10 years ago now exactly, I did a master's, and the dissertation was on the politics of language. And I focused on Yiddish and Hebrew. And so I looked at specifically how Yiddish and Hebrew were used in 20th century Jewish political thought, and especially in debates around Zionism. And there were underlying themes, and of course this is simplified, but it is broadly speaking accurate that a lot of those who were more on the Yiddish side of things tended to be more on the Bund side of things, and then in contrast to that, what became the language of Zionism, i.e., modern Hebrew, uh, contrasted itself against the Bund or against Hereness, against Doikayt, we might say, with the there-ness of Zionism, i.e., like the homeland isn't here, it's over there. It wasn't, as far as I could tell, like a very well-known one. And I'm not Jewish, I don't have a personal connection to it. And there was a bit of a, as my uncle put it, a bit of a me trying to be provocative as a, Lebanese Palestinian doing this kind of research. And maybe there is. He didn't mean it in a complimentary way, but maybe there is. Since then, it's been 10 years since just, going into it and doing kind of my own little thing, a bit of a rabbit hole and just my own small project, if you want, that was just for a university, master's, whatever. The topic it tends to be in response to Israel's actions in Gaza, and obviously since 2023 and the ongoing genocide, it's gotten even more prescient. It's forced a lot of diaspora Jews, like Jewish Americans and others, to think about how what there was a recent podcast of Jewish Currents, which I recommend, called on Zionist realism. How even people who call themselves anti-Zionists are still often limited, by the horizon set by Zionism, effectively. So all of these things, these conversations have become more common, which I'm personally very happy to see. What has your kind of experience been with that as well? Like in the past, like in 2015, 2016, when I was writing it, the big story in many ways, at least in our circles, I would say, is that, Bernie didn't go to APAC. There was like a massive thing because like a major democratic whatever did not go to APAC, and of course he's Jewish, and that kind of pissed off a lot of people. And since then, we've seen, in comparison to that, like this feels a bit mild, not that important even compared to how many more people, like Jewish Americans and others, have, and yourself as well, like done sit-ins, blocked roads, all of that stuff. It's become much, much more of a active thing, if that's fair to say.
I think that the hideousness and the vileness of the Israeli genocide, and also what I can only describe as like the whining piss baby cry bully actions of their defenders in the US, who simultaneously pretend to feel victimized while calling for students to be locked in cages. I think all of this will make anyone who has a basic ethical compass be pretty disgusted at Israel. And that includes, young Jewish Americans and old Jewish Americans too. And I think that there's a huge rift going on between people who are just looking at the horrors that Israel is inflicting with open eyes and saying, fuck no, not in my name. And then other people who are so tied and hamstrung, in my opinion, by, loyalties to tribe, loyalties to, communal groups, to religious leaders, that they're allowing themselves to forsake the basic adult responsibility, the basic adult ethical responsibility of looking the truth in the eye and acting on it. So that's what's going on with Jews becoming anti-Zionists, or just Jews standing against what Israel's doing right now. Now, the thing about Zionism is Zionism has always been built on an ideology that is called the negation of the diaspora. What this meant was that the Jewish communities all over the world, whether they were in Yemen or Istanbul or New York City or Moscow or Volkovsk, like my great-grandfathers, these communities were shit. They meant nothing. The only real lasting Jewish community that mattered was the Jewish community in Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. This ideology of the negation of the diaspora went alongside the belittling and the suppression of diaspora languages and cultures. It's pretty well known right now how horrifically Arab Jews were treated, but there was an equal, or I don't want to say equal, but there was a real violence that was, used to suppress Yiddish as well. And Yiddish was the most widely spoken Jewish language in the world. It was the language of the Eastern European Jewish street. It was the first language of most American Jews as well. In Palestine, even before the creation of the Israeli state, Yiddish was suppressed with violence. It was suppressed with mobs of armed young guys that would throw smoke bombs into events and beat the crap out of people and, burn down their kiosks. This suppression, obviously continued under the Israeli state. And it also continued in the ways that Jewish communal stuff was funded. So there would always be more funding for Hebrew school than Yiddish school, even if your own grandparents, spoke Yiddish. However, I think that as a consequence of the unspeakable monstrosities that Israel is doing right now, a lot of Jewish people from a variety of backgrounds are starting to look into their own heritage and look back to what that was before Zionism colonized everything. And, Jews come from all over the world. So this might be, a Jewish girl from Thessaloniki looking back at her great grandparents who spoke Ladino, right? But for the vast majority of American Jews, what this means is looking back at your grandparents who spoke Yiddish. And there's this real tragedy, right? That I think is common to many people who came from cultures that lost languages to suppression and lost languages to genocide, in the sense that we can't directly speak to our great grandparents. If I so I'm half Puerto Rican, and I can read my Puerto Rican grandfather's journal where he talks about my dad being born. There's nothing keeping me from learning Spanish. It's a huge language. It would be the same, if I was Russian, right? If I was French, if I was Arab. These are all massive imperial languages. But other languages, for instance, if I was Kurdish, right? Or if I spoke Western Armenian, or if, I was a speaker of an indigenous language, right? Or Yiddish. These are languages whose speakers have been so whittled down by genocide and then by persecution and erasure that it's in some ways cut off our ability to speak to our own past. When I learned Yiddish, it felt like an act of necromancy. All of a sudden, I didn't have to rely on academics or translators. I could speak directly to my ancestors and I could listen to them. It was like this sort of magic, like reclamation. And I certainly don't think everyone needs to learn Yiddish. Dear God, it's not the most useful language in the world, but I still think that magic of being able to speak directly and listen directly to my people was something that I don't know if I could have replaced any other way.
As part of Zionism and becoming hegemonic, you mentioned there were street battalions in Tel Aviv, for example, Jerusalem and other places, Haifa, where they would quite literally attack someone who would speak Yiddish publicly. I used a photo in one of my newsletter articles from, it was 1928, and the title is Wounded Yiddishists After an Attack by Hebrew Language Fanatics in Tel Aviv, 1928. And there was a very, obviously there's a concrete purpose as to why that was the case, not just to elevate the status of Hebrew in relation to Yiddish, but in many ways the war was against the very concept of multiplicity, of having different heritage, of being more than one thing, because they were quite literally creating, they even called it at one point the new Hebrew man. And there's the gender aspect to all of this, of course, as well. And there was even a scholar that I used, family name is Lang, I don't remember the first name, but who called it linguistic fascism in the land of Zion. And they were referring to their own family history. And the quote I use, family lore in most Ashkenazi households in Israel will almost inevitably include stories of grandparents and great-grandparents experiencing discrimination whenever they spoke Yiddish in the streets of 1940s and 1950s Tel Aviv. And there's a lot of irony in all of this, because even flyers that were saying stuff like, learn Hebrew, every Jew in Palestine, and this was of course before Israel, whether, he had this, I'm quoting here, whether he has just come or whether he is a long-standing resident, must speak and conduct all his business in the old new language of the Jewish people, Hebrew. And the irony with all of this is that, of course, this was a poster written in Yiddish, because most of those who could actually read it, who belong to the community, would be native Yiddish speakers. In order to create this new national identity, the old one or the old ones, because usually there was a multiplicity that had to be crushed, had to be really turned into taboo, dangerous, riskier. By doing that, at the same time, elevating the status of Hebrew, like you could climb the social ladder better if your Hebrew was better, and so on and so forth. So there is very much this argument that was made, and it was the language that created the state. Without that, it would have been more difficult to assimilate, quote unquote, which was of course a very brutal process. For example, what would later be called Mizrahi Jews. Mizrach just means East in Hebrew, i.e. Jews from mostly Arabic speaking lands who may or may not have identified themselves as Arabs into the by then already established state of Israel. Were there not already some kind of model that can just be applied and basically forced to integrate into? And in contrast to that, what I found kind of powerful about Doikayt, and you talk about this a lot in the book, especially in the conclusion that you sent me earlier, is that there's a rejection of this desire to be only one thing. Like you can be, of course, fiercely Jewish, but you're also, from there, from this neighborhood, from this is your background. Your background is likely multiple things at once. What ties you together is not just your Jewishness, but also your desire for a better world as part of your socialism and so on and so forth. Since the Bund was effectively crushed as part of the crushing of European Jewry as part of the Holocaust, a lot of mostly like Zionist historiography, i.e. how they tell the history of Yiddish, of the Bund, of even of Europe in general, is one almost like a victorious one, right? Like, it was like we were proven right basically by the Holocaust, or we were proven right by the success of Zionism or whatever, and you reject that.
Absolutely. So I want to talk a little bit about specifically what the Bund meant with Doikayt, which both included Yiddish but wasn't limited to that. The Bund was an Eastern European Jewish organization. It had members that lived in Berlin or Paris or New York. Most of its members ended up fleeing to New York. The ones that survived, there is still a branch in Melbourne, but at its heart, it is an Eastern European organization that is deeply rooted in the streets and villages and cities and twisted alleyways of the former land of the Pale of Settlement. And in addition to rejecting Zionism because they thought it was racist and imperialist and extremely stupid, they also rejected it because despite everything, they loved Eastern Europe. They loved Warsaw. They loved Vilnius. They loved these places as their home. And they did so much to try to give Jewish communities this feeling that here where you live is your country. One thing that I remember when I was reading the memoir of Bernard Goldstein, who was their militia leader in interwar Warsaw, is he talks about these summer camps that they set up and these hiking groups. Because Jews formerly, they didn't really have a lot of access to these rural spaces, and they certainly didn't have a culture that made them feel comfortable, hiking around in the Polish mountains. And the Bund was like, no, these are your mountains. This is your nature. These are your wildflowers and your hills and your rivers. And this earth belongs to you just as much as it does to anyone else, and it's yours to love. The same with the cities. They had a whole, geography of schools, of theaters, of poetry readings, of cafes, of social clubs where they would deliberately piss off religious Jews at. They had a whole architecture, right, that they loved. They were rooted in these places. And one of the most gut-wrenching things about writing my book was writing about how this whole architecture, this whole world that they built out of love and grit was just systematically just murdered by the Nazis, who murdered 3 million Jews in Poland alone. Half of the Jews that were killed in the Holocaust were killed in Poland. However, the Bund was not, just crushed by the Nazis alone. The Stalinist regime that took over Poland after the war forced the Bund to liquidate itself. Ironically, one of the Bund's last acts in Poland before it was forced to liquidate, but when it was still pretty controlled by the Stalinists, was that they congratulated Israel on its creation. And they did that because Stalin backed Israel, and Stalin armed the Haganah to do the Nakba. And so because of that, the Polish branch was forced to congratulate this group that had always been their enemies. But it wasn't even just the Stalinists or the Nazis that killed the Bund in Poland. It was also the fact that after the war, over 1,000 Polish Jews were murdered by their Polish fellow citizens because of a conflation between Jews and communists, and also because a lot of Poles had moved into their houses and didn't want to give them back. These three things crushed the idea of Doikayt in Eastern Europe in the most hideous and brutal possible way. I wrote about how after the war and after all of these murders by nationalists, you had all of these Bundist survivors begging the American Bund for visas to America. They wanted to move to New York after the war. There's a quote by Yakov Pat, who was a Bundist who had spent the war in America, who went back in 1946 to give aid. And one of his interlocutors tells him, in Poland, you can smell the ships, and it doesn't matter whether they're going to America or to Palestine. People just want out. Now, the other thing to me that is interesting is that because I am Jewish and because I grew up with the pathologies of my community, just as we all grew up with the special pathologies of our own community, is I had grown up thinking about the Holocaust almost like an argument. Like the Holocaust proved this group right, or the Holocaust proved this group wrong. And it was only much later, and it was only after actually going to Armenia and going to the Genocide Museum in Armenia and feeling this like real kinship with what, Armenians had been through, that I realized, I'm like, no Armenian says their fellow Armenians were stupid for being murdered by the Young Turks. No Armenian spits on their ancestors like that. And then I started talking to my friends who were, Black Americans, and no one would say that a Black American was stupid or wrong because they didn't go to Liberia and their ancestors endured lynchings, that this is pathological and insane. And yet, this sort of logic is so imbued in Jewish communities. And the more I read about this history, the more I realized like what a lie it is. I mean, the first thing was that the vast majority of Jewish refugees from Hitler were able to survive because they went to the Soviet Union, and often were thrown in gulags and forced labor camps, but because they went to the Soviet Union. And that this is not an argument for the moral greatness of Stalinism. It's just the truth. It's like people who are refugees, they go wherever they can to survive. And it's also the case that Palestine was not safe because of the brilliant fighting prowess of the Haganah. It was safe because the British Army stopped Rommel in Egypt. And if the British Army had not stopped Rommel in Egypt, then the Jews in Palestine would have been slaughtered just like the Jews in Poland. So this whole idea of using the Holocaust as an argument over who is right and who is wrong is this attempt to slap some pat moral lesson on the hideous contingencies of a genocide.
No one would argue that because so many found refuge and were obviously compared to being under the Nazi rule safer under Stalin, that therefore this means that the Stalinist model was the best suited one for Jewish liberation. And yet that's kind of the argument that is used to effectively retroactively justify Zionism. What I'm fascinated by, that for me, Doikayt, as again, I don't have the specific heritage, but I have seen it being kind of used more and more in even broader sense, like beyond just Jewish communities. In fact, in the recent essay by Naomi Klein and Astra Taylor, and I should say Naomi was on this podcast and will be again with Astra in a month or so. They end the essay by citing you and by talking about Doikayt. And there is something, because for me there is something about Doikayt, not just as a concept that in and of itself is a powerful one. Hereness is something that I think, whether you're a part of a diaspora or whether you're not, there's something very powerful about that. Fundamentally, it means community, it means rootedness. It's a very human desire. But at the same time, it's also a rejection of this narrative that because the Holocaust happened, that therefore the fundamental principles of the Jewish labor Bund can be discarded alongside it. That is what you've written. Towards the end, you say, why do I write about the Bund who lost, who were failed, and not about victorious killers? And then you describe, you're rejecting the very premise. Just because a movement was crushed, quite literally physically crushed by the Nazis, so by effectively an empire, does not mean that the ideas behind the movement themselves are not worth surviving and enduring and growing and, thriving and so on.
Exactly. I think that the concept of Doikayt is probably the Bund's greatest intellectual contribution to the generations that came after. And I absolutely think it's for everyone. I don't think that it's a concept for Jews alone. And I think it's especially relevant to every persecuted minority because it was a concept that was written by members of a persecuted minority, by people who believed that they had the right to stay in their homes, even if the whole country wanted them dead, that they had a right to glory in their culture and develop their language, even if everyone said it was jargon, that they had a right to flourish and to live and to love in their own country of their birth. In a lot of ways, as a Puerto Rican woman as well, I see Doikayt as something that the Young Lords were doing. The Young Lords was a Puerto Rican radical Marxist group in New York and Chicago that fought for the dignity of poor and working class Puerto Ricans in deeply racist and fucked up times. I see Dokeyt as something enacted by the Black Panthers, who were fighting not to make an ethno-state in Africa, but to fundamentally transform and liberate America. And not just for themselves, but in coalition with others. I quote Fred Hampton in my book extensively, and I compare what he was saying to Bundist thinkers. And most of all, when I think of Dokeyt, I think that it has two parts. The first is a rejection of the idea that you have to go elsewhere and sort yourself into your perfect little ethno-state, your perfect little God-given piece of land in order to be whole. It's a rejection of that. But on the other hand, it's an assertion of your right to stay and make home where you are. It's a deeply cosmopolitan view. It's a view that is one that acknowledges people's right to move. It rejects the stupid American nativist idea that we have now, and also the blood and soil idiocies that are happening in so many places around the world. And it says, like, no, here where you are, you have the right to have home.
It's worth really, at least at this stage in this conversation, like emphasizing what you just said is applicable to so many contexts. As you've mentioned, the Black Panthers parties, of course, and even if we limit ourselves to like cultural productions, you wouldn't have music like jazz if you didn't have a strong community in New Orleans, despite the challenges, obviously, of being an African American in New Orleans in the 19th century and early 20th century. You wouldn't have blues, obviously, for similar reasons in the Deep South. Were it not for a recognition by those who participate that it's worth fighting for where we are as well. It has a value, our connection to the land, our connection to our history, our connection to our lineage and heritage, even if that lineage and that heritage is riddled with trauma. As you know, basically 3-4 generations of my own family is all about forced migration and displacement due to war and famine and whatnot. It doesn't mean that there isn't something that can still be preserved that's worth preserving. In the context of our conversation now, since this is my own personal timeline, it's not the center of the universe, but like since I started researching this topic in 2015, we've seen so much changing politically, mostly for the worse in terms of global trends, and moving more and more towards this nativist, ethno-purist, anti-diversity of politics. At the same time, as we've seen this, for example, in the US, in Hungary, in Russia, in India, and so on, they all have something positive to say, to put it very mildly, about Israel. They are projecting their desires for an ethno-supremacist state by looking at the Israeli model, at what Zionism has accomplished in Israel-Palestine, and they clearly want to apply this where they live as well. There is something there, right? Like there's a reason why the Trump administration has already put so many Christian Zionists, like the US ambassador to Israel, and why Orban is such a close buddy with Netanyahu, and why Modi has never had anything bad to say about Netanyahu, and so on and so forth. They see themselves in what the state of Israel has become.
I agree with you. I mean, I think a lot of it, especially in the case, obviously, of Modi, it just comes from this deep hatred of Muslims and this idea that Israel is persecuting Muslims, I think, is what is so attractive to countries like India and Orban's Hungary as well. But I think the other thing that attracts them about Zionism, or their idea of Zionism, is it has this dual cleansing and erasure to it. Zionism both involves the ethnic cleansing of the other, the murder and expulsion of Palestinians on one hand, which all of these regimes fantasize about. All of them fantasize about ethnic cleansing of the other. But Zionism also involves the cleansing of the in-group, of the self, the cutting off of dissident, solidaristic, impure parts of its own people's history to create this. I'm just going to use Ta-Nehisi Coates' words, this corny ass narrative that's simple and pure and stupid. And I think that all of these countries would like to be able to do that about their own people, whether it's Modi trying to create some Hindu Rashtra, as he said, or whether it's this weird image of apparently 1890s America that Trump is pushing. I think they all like the idea of kicking out the ethnic other and violently suppressing and eliminating the intellectual other that Zionism represents to them.
The fact that the Israeli state has very firmly allied itself with the far right around the world, that same far right that is deeply anti-Semitic, must have served as a catalyst as well to accelerate this trend that we've been talking about. Like more people, especially if they were Jewish themselves, who have this Zionist realism, as the Jewish Currents podcast put it, it must have facilitated or catalyzed the questioning at the very least of like, how could that possibly be the case that this very notoriously anti-Semite like Orban is also very cozy with Netanyahu? How can it be like someone like Trump, who has a long history of anti-Semitic statements and who is very comfortable being around anti-Semites, in addition to Steve Bannon, etc., 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 must have accelerated the need for many people to start looking elsewhere. And I think the more there are stories like the ones that you are platforming in your book, that you're telling and that you're retelling, the easier it would be for this as of now like emerging trend to become more and more normalized. Because fundamentally, Zionism is a story, right? Or at least multiple stories, but it is fundamentally a story. And the way it tells itself that story is very different than how myself or, a Palestinian in Israel, Palestine, especially in Gaza or the West Bank right now, how they've experienced Zionism. There is very much a we were oppressed and now because we have a strong army, but instead of seeing what happened, and especially the Holocaust, and applying a very firm never again to anyone, anywhere, the lesson that was kind of embodied in the state of Israel and practiced and basically rendered hegemonic is that we need to be extremely strong, have no empathy, no kindness. Human rights do not apply to our perceived enemies. They are all homogeneous. The Palestinians are all a homogeneous group, so it doesn't matter if they're children. There is no room for nuance. There is no room for empathy and whatnot. And the moment we're currently experiencing in many ways, and you yourself cite a bunch of them, you can say has been prophesized by multiple anti-Zionist Jewish intellectuals.
I want to de-exceptionalize Zionism a little bit, and I want to talk about why these violent supremacist ideologies come after genocides, because Zionism is hardly the only violent supremacist ideology that was embraced after horrific violence was inflicted on people. So the Bund's whole attitude of Hereness, of Doikayt, and not just the Bunds, but I think, so socialists, like just, humanistic intellectuals in general, it depends on the idea that there is the possibility of human solidarity with people who are not in your group. The Bund in Poland, they worked alongside the Polish Socialist Party. They believed that they did not believe that, Poland was this undifferentiated mass of racists that they were doomed to be stuck with. They believed that there were some Polish people who were progressive, some Polish people who were assholes, some Polish people who were indifferent, and that it was a society that you could work within, an alliance with Polish people to make it better. So this sort of thinking, it depends on the belief that this human solidarity is possible. I think about Fred Hampton's Rainbow Coalition as well, where he literally was organizing white poor Appalachian kids who formerly flew the Confederate flag, the Young Patriots, they were called. There was this idea that you're not just stuck in your own group, but rather there's a larger human solidarity that you could contribute to and rely on. Now, during and after the Holocaust, and before the Holocaust as well, the Western democracies who have always held themselves out as the bastions of human rights and freedom and democracy were, as they are now, revolting hypocrites. They did not accept Jewish refugees in any numbers. They were incredibly cruel to them. When they did accept people, they did it in weird ways, like the orphan manufacturing aid program called Kindertransport, which, was like forced every German parent to make a Sophie's choice about which kid, German Jewish kid they would save. The Western world basically betrayed the Jewish people of Europe. And after the war, they continued to betray them by not taking in refugees and by letting people rot in displaced persons camps. And when the supposed apostles of freedom and democracy turn out to be violent and bloody hypocrites, this creates an opening for groups that promise strength through violence themselves. When I think about the Bund, and I think about not just them, but all of the brilliant Jewish humanist intellectuals who kept that humanism through the genocide and afterwards, through these displaced persons camps, I only think about how the world failed them. And I think about how if we as a world wish to deserve humanists like that, we can never fail our basic obligations of solidarity. I don't think of it as like that the Jews failed to, learn from the Holocaust. I see it as the world, especially the Western world, the Western democracies failed to provide basic human solidarity upon which any humanism by the victim rests.
We're seeing today, and I think it's very difficult to argue against this, that you have these kind of ghosts of history, the ghosts of the past or whatever, in the sense that like the type of white supremacy, at least the way it was manifested, let's say in the 30s and 40s, we're seeing like that impulse by like a percentage of the white population of America today kind of coming back in many ways and being very comfortable, or more increasingly so. Period, the decades now in which it was not even politically smart, including if you were a Republican, to be that vocally open about it. So you would do so in different ways. Now they're kind of like the need to pay lip service to stuff like human rights and stuff like democracy and freedom of speech and whatnot. It's going away and very quickly. Like at some point, I think they won't even bother using these terms at all. Now they still do from time to time, but much less so than, for example, last year. But if that's the case, if like the systems of oppression and those who participate in those systems of oppression clearly see that like the past can be recreated in the future, and sorry, in the present, regardless of whether that will happen or not, but they clearly believe that it can, and they are acting as though that is a reality. That also means, of course, that we will suffer the consequences because they are the ones with the power. So why not recognize that if they are doing that, doesn't that also mean that the way we resisted in the past, or the very least the ideas that underpinned those resistance efforts, including, of course, Doikayt, in the past, shouldn't they be also revisited and adapted to the modern world? They were able to conjure up and to imagine a much better future than the one that befell on them. Yeah, but they were still able to do that work of creating something. And fundamentally, those are stories. In the same way that fascism has its set of stories, usually around the hero arc and, of course, a male thing. It's a very gendered phenomenon, and there has to be a hierarchy. And if you have money or you are powerful, that must mean that you have some kind of God-given right or divine providence or whatever it is. Those are stories. And what we need to be better at, and this is very much the message of that essay that Klein and Asra Taylor also wrote, and we'll explore more when they come on the podcast. What we need to be better at is having stories that are not just able to resist the fascist stories, but they're able to create something in their own right, because we absolutely need that horizon. We need that vision. We need to know that we're doing, that this is worth fighting for, that like there is something that is good about this world that is just worth fighting for. And that is a story, or rather stories. And I do think Doikayt in the 21st century, I'm not even talking about Doikayt 100 years ago, I'm talking about Doikayt here and now, has a role to play.
I loved Naomi and Astra's piece about the techno-fascist doomsday bastards. I love when Naomi calls them traitors to this world, people who are willing to burn this earth in order to make AI that will churn out big titty anime girls and make spaceships that will help us colonize Mars with video game playing AIs. These people they're people who hate the physical world, the reality. Like the most basic thing about Doikayt is that like I am here, you are here, we are on this earth with this land beneath our feet, and this is what the world is. And the Thiels and the Musks and the Altmans of the world have no love for that. They have no love for like the crooked streets of a city where everyone knows each other, and they have no love for the natural world either. All they can imagine is messianic transcendence of the body and some sort of uploading of the mind to the cloud and some sort of forsaking of the planet Earth itself for a weird interplanetary fever dream. They have no love of the world. And I think the basic thing that underpins everything that makes me a leftist, or just that underpins how I think, is that I love this world. I love the fucked up streets of New York City and its rickety rack fire escapes, city where I was born in. I love all of the messed up people I see every day. The guy who hollers at me in front of the bodega, or the old lady who feeds the cats. Like I love this flawed, fucked up world full of beauty and multiplicity and weirdness and humanity. And the idea of burning all of that for some tech dystopia, some AI fueled, ultra controlled, ultra privatized hellhole, which is what Musk and Thiel wants, is so anathema to me. And I think that the story that we need to tell is the one of loving this world.
Absolutely. And maybe we can slowly wrap up on that positive note, because what I find fascinating, and of course Klein and Taylor describe it as end-time fascism, is that it's not even the fact that what they are declaring that they want, i.e. uploading their mind or on whatever and then having that being part of some generative AI to somehow live forever, or having a colony on Mars or whatever. Factually speaking, like if we just stick to the facts, there's actually no path forward that makes that more likely at any point. There's no technology that allows the mind to be uploaded. They don't even seem to understand what the mind is. They just think we are computers and we have data in our brains like a computer does, which is how they apply that kind of stereotypically engineer brain. At the same time, Musk is undermining basic science, which is what you need to go to Mars. And so he's not going to Mars, at least not in the near time future. And I don't think he's going to have much of a role on that. They have this there's something hopeful about all of that. I'll try to explain why. The way that if they were cold-hearted geniuses that are only focused on the long-term plan of things, they would have actually understood something that elites of past generations kind of understand. I'm thinking of the industrialists of part of the UK, for example, like in Birmingham, that despite the fact that they made a lot of money out of that, they exploited labor that, of course, they profited from, somehow they still sort of understood that it would benefit them to have a population that has like decent libraries that are publicly accessible. They somehow understood that, like, oh, if my workforce is happy and they like to work for me and whatnot, that's probably very good for me. Like they sort of had this at Bailey's understanding that, like, I'm from this place, I made a lot of money, and now I want to give back under this kind of liberal framework, which is, it's not mine, but it is one that exists.
Yeah, they knew that if they didn't do this basic maintenance of the social contract, that a mob would come with the fucking pitchforks
Exactly.
and on it. And now these dummies are so unempathetic, they can't even imagine that.
they physically cannot, at the very least, after several years of not having any reason to and being incentivized to not do so, but they currently are unable to even understand why a public library exists. Something in their brain, like it just doesn't compute. And this is the strength that we have, is that we do understand this. We do have a heritage, we do have this knowledge that most humans on this planet have of like there is a reason why we have those public libraries. There is a reason why, this is unfortunately not an American thing, but more of a British thing. We've had the NHS, which is now being privatized, but there's a reason why it existed in the first place. And so on and so forth. There's a reason why there is such a thing as the social contract. There is a reason why we've reached those basic conclusions that most people, regardless of how they may or may not identify politically, sort of have this almost instinctual understanding that if my neighbor is not miserable, if my neighbor is also happy, I'm probably better off. People who go into the suburbs usually will not be on the progressive side of things, but what they're seeking is supposedly stability and whatever, but they cannot have that if the neighbors around them are not also stable and whatnot, which is why it becomes a privileged thing. Or like most of them will already have some amount of money, and so they go to a certain area that where other people have a certain amount of money. Because what does that actually mean? It means that the other people don't have any reason to go after you. They don't have any reason to want what you have because they also have the basics, and so on and so forth. So in that case, it would be like a gated community version of security, and that's very much what the Thiels and the Musks and so on. That's how they view the world. That's why they think that all they need really is to buy an island or to buy an underground bunker in New Zealand or, Zuckerberg's island in Hawaii or whatever. Because they just think that they don't actually need the society around them. They don't actually need the human beings that have made them who they are because they don't believe that this is the case. They don't believe that this is the factual story that led them to where they are today. They believe that there's something inherently great about who they are. And there is a weakness there. It means that in many ways they're not anticipating certain scenarios. They're not anticipating that if they continue worsening everything for most people, at some point this can come at them. And that's not even just what matters to me necessarily. At the very least, that's not like my horizon. Let's say it's step one. But what I would like to be step two and three and five and 10 is how do we get to a point where people like that are rendered irrelevant? Like there's no structural basis for them to exist in the first place. That's the challenging bit, of course, but we do need those stories to help us get there.
And when you talk about vulnerabilities, you had a term I really liked, which is engineer brain.
Yeah.
So there's this
No,
amazing book.
no offense to good engineers, but yeah, it is a problem.
Engineers, we need you, obviously. Um, but there's this book by Kate Crawford called The Atlas of AI, where she talks a lot about the physicality of AI, the training data, the data centers, the minerals, like all of that. She was talking about the software that's supposed to recognize people's emotions. This software, the training data, was based on the idea that people only have five emotions, that the emotions are never mixed, that if you're feeling the emotion, you will display it. So if you're happy, you will smile. And if you're sad, you will frown. And then the way that these AIs were trained was by feeding them photos of actors doing big, silly smiles and big theatrical frowns. I was reading this and I was like, this is by people who don't understand humans. Only someone who deeply doesn't understand and probably has contempt for humans thinks that the stripper really likes you because she's smiling. And
Exactly.
actually what these AIs are used for, it's not actually to detect people's real emotion, it's to force employees to put on smiles all the time, lest the camera catch them frowning and ding them. I was reading this and I was like, my God, I know these people are smart, but God, they are fucking dumb. And that's the weakness. If people are so dumb that they believe that the stripper really likes them because she's smiling, and they believe there are only five emotions, and they believe that everything in the world is reducible to ones and zeros.
I think the best thing, or rather the most emblematic thing, and I will slowly wrap up at least on my end, and then I'll let you have the final word, is we saw recently the trend of Ghiblification or Ghiblification, i.e. like Studio Ghibli, Miyazaki, of course, using the aesthetics of Ghibli to create various scenes. And so we saw the White House have like this horrible image of like a Hispanic woman being arrested by this ICE agent. And we saw Sam Altman, because this was on ChatGPT, change his profile pic. And we saw the IDF join in on the fun, of course, and all of that stuff. People responded and reacted online. There was lots of talk and whatever. But for me, as someone who is like, the Miyazaki movies are a huge part of my childhood, and they remain to this day. And as someone who has a 18 months old kid, I see them having this use also for like years to come. I just saw something very powerful in what happened, because Miyazaki, for those who don't know, is, I mean, on record famously saying that he's anti-AI, and he described it as like, we humans have lost faith in ourselves. And this was like 10 years ago, when it was very primitive. And he said something along the lines of, this is an insult to life itself. There was someone who took that quote and him saying that and actually turned it into a Ghiblified, image, which really, for me, says so much, that ultimately they don't believe that there is such a thing as art. They genuinely believe that all they need is a technology that can replicate a simulacrum of the thing that they actually want to be able to do, but they're unable to, or they don't want to put the effort, or whatever it is. And they fundamentally don't believe that they should. Brian Merchant described this as like, AI has become the aesthetics of fascism, because fundamentally they get to bypass the artwork, the worker who creates the work of art in the first place, and they get to just have the superficiality of it all without having anything beyond that. But the powerful thing for me, the reason why I wasn't as doom and gloomy about that ridiculous trend, is that, well, this kind of says that fundamentally the only thing that they're able to do is to copy what their betters have done. And they're unable to do, like Miyazaki famously did most of these artwork like by hand even. They can't comprehend the why would you waste, and how they would interpret it, of course, being a waste, like hours and weeks and months on this one scene just to perfect how like Chihiro in Spirited Away puts on her shoes or something like that. Like, why would you waste your time for something like that? And the answer obviously is that because you've created something beautiful that other people get to also enjoy for its own sake. And those things are the things that endure. So the kind of the hopeful thing for me is that in many ways we don't have to reinvent the wheel. Of course, there are certain things that we will have to learn because they're new in 2025, in the 21st century and whatnot. But not everything is completely new. There are certain things that as humans we've already done that are perfectly fine, that we already enjoy, like art, like literature, like, having a nice movie or whatever, like meeting together and having a barbecue or a picnic or camping, whatever it is. There are certain things that we've been doing through the ages for a reason. It's because we genuinely enjoy them. And there is something to be said about the concept of Doikayt, to go back to that. The power of Hereness isn't to say that here is perfect or there's no problem or whatever. As you said, like, we live in fucked up context because of the world we live in. But despite that, there is still the beauty of humanity that is worth fighting for, again, to go back to that. And for me, that is the power of Doikayt. That's why, for me, the best thing that the Sam Altmans of this world, after billions and billions and billions of dollars invested in ChatGPT, is to do something that only approximates what a bunch of animators in Japan did by hand. And for me, that's very powerful.
They hate artists. They hate artists because we have the music. We have something that is beyond ones and zeros, that is beyond the reduction of all of the world to the digital binary. And they hate it and they envy it. And they take a vindictive love in ripping us off and in thinking that they can destroy our incomes or that they could destroy our status. But they hate us because they can't be us. Theirs is an entire philosophy that is built by people who don't know what it's like to do anything for its own sake, out of love of other people, or out of love of the thing itself. And you're
Yeah.
right. In many ways, I feel like the most profound act of resistance that we can do is out into the real physical world with our people and conspire, in the old meaning of the term, which is to share breaths with one another.
And we have the tools to, again, challenges notwithstanding, and this is in no way like downplaying the challenges, because of course they're there. But it is important to remember that if they say that this is their vision of the world, this techno dystopian future, it doesn't mean that they will get it. Now, what it might mean is that they cause a lot of damage in the process. So, like, we will not get generative AI as they are imagining they would get it, But what we are getting is them spending, like ChatGPT on its own, I believe, spends as much energy on a yearly basis than like 100 plus countries around the world. So it is the existing structures of income inequality, of disparities, energy disparities among them, richer countries polluting more than poor countries, and richer people within the richer countries polluting more than the poor people within those richer countries. Those are the existing problems of our world. What they are doing is accelerating the negative aspects of them. Though they're accelerating the income inequalities, they're making it more difficult for people to live, but they're not creating new stories that I think can endure in the long term. Now, the caveat to that is the big if, which is if we don't let them. And I do think we have the tools to just not let them win, not let them get away with what they think that they will get away with. And I think we do have absolutely that is a very, very feasible scenario because there is way more of us than there are of them. And at some point, I think we will realize this. But again, caveat being that we need to actually work for it. It won't happen naturally. This is my my pitch to listeners of the Variety Times. Molly, as always, thank you so much for coming. And please talk about your upcoming book. Where can people find it? Is it already up for pre-order? What's happening?
Oh God, my book is currently with my editor in endless edits hell. Supposedly it will be out next spring 2026. I know that's way too late, but such is what the gods of publishing say. And it is called Here Where We Live Is Our Country, the story of the Jewish labor Bund.
Amazing. And where can people find you online?
They can find me at mollycrabapple.com, or they can subscribe to my Substack, mollycrabapple at substack.com, where I just sort of shoot off my mouth. And also you can find me in the real world periodically. Come to one of my events, bring me some cigars and whiskey.
As for me, you can find me on Blue Sky as well as Mastodon. I also have the newsletter hauntologies.net. To support this podcast, the Fire These Times, as well as all of our other sister podcasts, which are part of the From the Periphery Media Collective, the easiest thing to do is to go on patreon.com/From the Periphery. By doing so, you would not only be supporting us directly, but you'll get access to all of our podcasts in early access, occasional exclusive content, an invitation to our monthly hangout, as well as an invitation to our movie club, including the current one, which is on Lebanese cinema, and other things that we're still working on and that we will continue producing for you guys. And yeah, Molly, thank you so much for being on the Fire These Times.
Thanks so much. Bye, darling.